Hey y'all, welcome back to my shop. There was a question put up today by someone who was just getting into hand tool woodworking about what planes they should purchase and have in their shop, and was interested in learning how to mill stock by hand rather than using any power tools. Of course, power tools are a wonderful tool to get your stock repeatably flat and square, but there are instances in which hand tools are required. For example, a board that won't quite fit on your joiner, or something that is too wide for your planer, like a bench top. You have to have a way of flattening those, and hand planes are often the best solution, even though they only run on 1/16 horsepower, as Shannon Rogers is very fond of saying. So for someone just getting into hand planes, it can be a little overwhelming. You don't know which plane to buy, how much money you should spend on it. There's all these different kinds of steel. And usually you're on a budget, so where do you start? So I wanted to give you a quick overview of what hand planes are out there, which ones get used the most often in my shop, and some of the basic tasks where they can actually speed up your woodworking rather than taking the time to set up a power tool and making your cuts that way. So to start with, we'll go in size, increasing order of size, from the block planes, which in my shop are so important that they live in this tray right here. They're always on hand. The first one is just a standard block plane, and the one that I think is most well known is a Stanley 220, which is what this is. This 220 was used by my grandfather and then handed down to my dad, where it sat in his workbench for years and years, accumulating rust and all that sort of stuff. This one, after it was cleaned up and squared and lapped and everything, has become an indispensable tool in my shop. Mostly I use it for either truing up joinery, or it's really good at creating roundovers and chamfers. You can very easily, rather than going to the router table and setting up a router bit, a roundover bit, or a 45-degree bit for a chamfer, you can just run your plane down the edge of the board, and if you hold it at a consistent 45 degrees, you'll wind up with a very nice, light chamfer. If you alternate or change the radius or the angle at which you hold the plane, going more shallow, getting steeper and steeper, you can actually create a roundover with a hand plane. That's not perfectly round because you're dealing with a straight cutting edge, but nothing that a little run with some sandpaper won't turn into a perfect roundover. This is absolutely the faster tool to use when you're trying to chamfer or round over or break edges on any sort of workpiece. It's not particularly good at end grain because of the angle at which the blade sits. For that, there is a much better form of block plane called a low angle block plane, where you can see the blade sits at a much lower angle in relation to the workpiece. And this is a terrific tool because of that for making cuts where you would otherwise have a risk of tear out. For example, if you're truing up the end grain on a piece, the low angle plane is excellent for that task. You can get these nice shavings even on the end grain. Now I usually leave the low angle plane set pretty fine to take a not very aggressive cut, and when you use it you want to skew it to the angle. You don't want to run it perpendicular over the piece. The other thing you have to look out for when you're working with end grain like this is to either back up your cut on this side with another piece so that you don't tear these fibers out as the knife gets to, as the blade gets to the end of the cut. Or you can do simply what I did there and go from this side, stopping your cut near the end, come back over to the other side and cut from that end. The low angle plane is also just fine for doing your roundovers, breaking edges, anything like that. So if you're going to choose a block plane and you're only going to buy one, the low angle plane is probably the way to go. This is a very nice recreation of a Stanley Sweetheart. It has an adjustable wheel here. You can adjust the heaviness of the cut, and it has an adjustable throat where you can open and close the throat to get more aggressive or finer shavings, depending on what you're looking for. See, I'll set this and then I'll forget about it and forget to move it back. So those are your two basic kinds of block planes. Absolute must-haves in any shop, whether you're a power tool woodworker or a hand tool woodworker or somewhere in between. The low angle block plane, you got to have it in the arsenal. Moving up from there, I have the 4 bench planes that are used most frequently in my work. This is a number 3. It's typically considered a smoothing plane, and that's primarily what I use my number 3 for, is for final smoothing. If I do anything after I plane with the number 3, it may be a card scraper, maybe some 220 sandpaper, but most of the time, as long as the blade is sharp, you're going to get a finish ready surface right off the blade of this plane. Moving up from there, and this is a Wood River plane, which is just terrific. Like all planes, new or used, it requires sharpening right out of the box, and you have to work with it a little bit. But typically, you leave it set very fine, and you can get those beautiful gossamer shavings that everybody's looking for. And that you see all over YouTube. That's an even better one. Or you can make your own wooden toilet paper. It leaves an extremely smooth surface that if you're not sanding down to 220 grit, you're never going to feel a surface that smooth. It is ready for finish. Up from there is my best all-around plane, the one that sees the most action in the shop more than any other. And this is a Wood River 4.5. It's a little wider than the 3, but the angle is the same. This is my go-to plane for cleaning up stock, for cleaning up joints, for flattening short pieces of stock. It is what I use to clean up joints like dovetail joints, box joints, things like that. Moving up from there, I have a much larger bench plane, which I use for jointing shorter pieces. This is a Stanley number 6. Actually, this is a Bailey plane. And this one I purchased used, got a new blade for it. And then up from there, you have the classic number 7, which is just a monster. And why are they this big? Well, you can only get a surface as flat as the length of the sole. So if you're trying to flatten a tabletop or a bench top with a number 4, there's a chance that you could go in and up or all the way down, and you won't get totally flat because the sole of the plane is shorter than the piece that you're trying to flatten. Whereas you move up to a number 6 in a situation, if I was trying to flatten my bench top again, and God, I hope it's a long time before I ever have to do that again. The number 6 is long enough that it will cover this entire surface and get the whole thing flat, which is why they're excellent for jointing. If you were trying to joint a piece of stock, say, like this piece of red maple, the number 4, or the 4.5, could ride with the contours of the board rather than getting it totally flat. But the number 6, still too short. The number 7, though, take this puppy down. And leave you with a totally flat, jointed edge. Oh yeah, this one's reverse threaded. My apologies. I don't know how I got this thing set up backwards. Sort of cheating and just doing one side because I don't want this to be so long it drives you crazy. So you take a crooked piece of stock and you make it nice and flat. The bench planes all have the ability to go across the grain. You may read that you need to put a slight bevel on the edges of your plane blade in order to be able to do that, and it's not a bad idea. I do use a slight bevel on the edges of my number 6, but if you have a cup, a crown, or a cup on either side of the board, you simply go across the grain and it will flatten your piece. I would never work with rough stock with my beautiful smoothing blade. All of them can go across the grain. So on something like this, where there is a nice cup, you can throw it in there, attack it. Usually for this I would use the number 4.5, and you can take off that cup. Now it's nice and flat. And of course, going with the grain, it's perfectly good for smoothing out the surface, jointing the surface, face jointing it. You can go diagonally across the grain. You can go this way, you can go this way, you can go this way, and then go this way. Works in all directions. You do have to pay attention to grain direction when you're planing to minimize tear out. If you're planing against the grain, you will eventually be able to tell. When I first started using hand planes, it was not always easy to tell. Let's do the face grain. Which way the grain direction was running. But as you work it, if you feel chatter, or you start seeing tear out in the cuts, you'll be able to figure out which way you're working. The other thing is you can usually tell from the shavings. When they come off thicker in places and thinner in places, and have really jagged edges, that usually tells me I'm going against the grain. Whereas if you get a nice smooth cut, with sharp edges, that's usually an indication that you're going with the grain. If you're getting a lot of resistance on the sole of the plane, it never hurts to leave one of your wife's ridiculous candles that they have all over the house and just give it a little bit of wax on the sole. Which will keep it running nice and smooth. The 4.5 is also the plane that I use for shooting. It's the one that I set up for with my shooting board. So far, if you're wanting planes that you can use for all different applications, I have to say the low angle block plane and a 4.5. If you're really serious about trying to mill stock by hand rather than using power tools, then you have to have at least one jointer plane. A 6 or a 7, either are good choices. The 7 will give you the ability to work with longer stock and to flatten larger panels. Other than that, there are specialty planes. You mentioned a rabbet plane. I have 2 examples here, both of which I use frequently in the shop. This is one that you can find almost anywhere. It's a Stanley number 90. This is a terrific little plane. You can either use it with this top plate, or you can remove the top plate and use it as a chisel plane without the guard, allowing you to get into corners, to clean up joinery, things like that. But as just a standard rabbet plane, it works just fine. I cut a rabbet on the table saw over there and left it intentionally jagged. You can see where the opposing saw teeth left these little ridges in the rabbet. And this does just fine for cleaning up those ridges. Of course, you have to tighten the bastard back down or the top will fall off. And it takes off those ridges. A slightly larger version, and of course more expensive because this is a Veritas, this is a medium shoulder plane, and this will do the same thing. Leaving you with nice, clean rabbets. It's good for dados as long as your dado is that wide. And they call it a shoulder plane because it's also very good at cleaning up the shoulders and the cheeks of tenons. If you're into that whole mortise and tenon thing. So that's what I use most often. I have a few others out there. I have a couple more Veritas planes. But you don't need to spend a lot of money. You don't have to buy a Lee Nielsen. Both of these I found used, granted at Woodworking in America, where they have all sorts of people selling vintage and refurbished hand planes. But you can find the more common Stanley planes on eBay. You can find them in antique shops. And the most important thing about working with them is being able to restore the plane to a good working order. The sole of the plane has to be absolutely flat. So when you get one and there's a little crown or a little cup on the sole, you have to lap that sole. And then of course sharpening is really the biggest secret when it comes to having effective hand planes that you can use in the shop to solve problems rather than create more problems for yourself. So we'll do a video on sharpening plane blades a little bit in the future. Donnie, I hope that helps you, bud. These are the way to go. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you back next time.